Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, bodybuilder, back with another interview in my Ask the Expert series. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Alberts, who is the infamous 3D MJ Godfather of natural bodybuilding. He's an amazing resource and coach. He's been competing for 33 years. He has 2 pro cards in natural bodybuilding, and most recently placed 6th at the WNBF World Championships at the age of 48. Today, we'll be talking about his 2019 contest prep season and picking up some practical tips and advice on sustainability. I've learned a lot from Jeff. He's a great resource. Let's get right into it.
I just wanted to say that out of all the bodybuilders online, Jeff, you're the one guy that I follow most closely on Instagram stories.
Oh man, you're too nice. Thank you.
So yeah, this guy's an amazing resource. And today we're going to talk about your 2019 prep, Jeff. So first of all, I just sort of wanted to let you open up, start off with sort of when your prep started, the general course, and the shows that you competed in.
Okay, yes, this might take a while because it was
Okay.
a
Yeah.
it was a long prep, but yeah, we'll see how well we can do here. So it started back in September of 2018 and it ended in November of 2019. So we're talking like a 14-month prep. And I know a lot of people are going to look at that or hear that and think, "Oh my gosh, that's crazy. How did this guy prep for so long?" But it was more like a lifestyle than it was like a linear hardcore approach. So it was, having some phases in there where, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, date nights with the wife. Like I partaked in a lot of those life events, and that meant, deviating from your diet here and there. So I tried to stay as balanced as possible through the process, just from past history for doing this, like you said, for shit. I've been competing since the early 90s, and I used to have that hardcore mentality, hardcore approach, back when I was younger. And it wasn't always conducive with life. It kind of meant like sacrificing relationships and things like that, like, that sacrifice to win at all costs. So it just wasn't, let's say the healthiest lifestyle to partake in. So this prep, I want to just basically kind of just not so much coast, but pick my spots when to push and when to pull back. So it was kind of like more of like I said, a lifestyle approach to prep.
Mhm.
But it did have its moments where I had to dig, and I did have stretches where I was that hardcore bodybuilder. But I had plenty of stretches too where it's like, I didn't want my wife hating me, let's say, because I was just so focused on the prep itself. So that was basically the length of it, kind of the approach and style of it. And we can always dive deeper into the nuts and bolts, in between, the timeline there. But as far as the shows, I did 5 competitive shows and 2 guest posings. So it was 7 shows in total. The guest postings I still took very seriously. I just kind of factor, hey, people are paying money to see these shows. I don't want to show up not in shape. I don't want to, go light on my posing or anything like that. So I made sure to peak the best I could for those. So in a sense, it was 7 competitive shows. That's how I kind of approached it.
Mhm.
It started in July of 2019. That was my first show, was the California Muscle Mayhem,
Mhm.
and then it kind of ended at the WMBF Worlds, like you mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And I did 3 WMBF shows, and I did 1 NGA Pro show, and I did an NPC show, which
Mhm.
is a non-tested show. As a natural bodybuilder, and I still held my own there. So overall, it was a fantastic season. Like you said, at 48, I definitely, as far as my expectations, I think exceeded them. So I was pretty happy with how everything turned out.
Mhm. Yeah, and you looked amazing compared to like your prior seasons.
Yeah, I take pride in that. Like I take pride in the fact that, hey, at 48, I proved to myself, and I think I proved to a lot of people that you can still make progress. Deep into your 40s. Yeah, sure, not as fast as progress as it once was, like when I was in my 20s. But I mean, just being able to improve. It's yeah, I mean, it's like because a lot of people think like that 40 years. At the 40-year mark, people think like your testosterone just drops and you can't build muscle anymore, which is so untrue. So it's just kind of a nice token, as far as outside of the shows, like, hey, look what I could still do at this age, and I'm gonna still prove to people when I'm 50, I'm gonna get a little better.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, just to go a little bit more into the nuts and bolts, just for the listeners, Jeff recently did an interview with Steve Hall on Revive Stronger. So I apologize for any overlap, but I just want to have some of the basic stuff here covered. What was your starting and ending weight, and sort of the rate of weight loss, and did that change at different parts of prep?
Sure. So yeah, I started out about 203, I think it was, pounds. And I ended, I think the lowest weight I saw was a 168. But my stage weight was anywhere between 170, 172 for most of those shows.
Mhm.
The rate of loss, like I said, wasn't really linear. Like from September 2018 till around December of 2018, I more or less dropped 10 pounds just by cleaning up my diet a little bit. And kind of just, when you first start out, you can lose a lot of water weight and bloat. So the first 10 pounds, it was more or less pretty easy. Then after that, I took a little bit of a diet break through the holidays, gained a few pounds back. And then in January of this year, it's when I started to basically kind of get more in that prep mindset. And for me, I typically shoot for about a half a pound a week. What I've learned through past preps, like anything more than that, my physique usually is smaller. Like back in 2009, when I was shooting for that pound and a half rate of loss every week, I got on stage at about 160 pounds.
Mhm.
And in 2011, I changed the approach. I extended the diet out longer. So instead of prepping for 28 weeks, I think it was in 2009, with not too many diet breaks, and not too much refeeding, the approach in 2011 was, let's extend the weeks out. Because my thought process was, I just keep getting better. 2009, I kept getting better every week. So I'm like, hey, let me just extend the diet out in 2011. But this time, let's incorporate refeeds and diet breaks. And I got on stage 10 pounds heavier.
Wow.
And it was kind of unheard of at the time, because people were like, wow, Jeff was 38 when he won those pro cards in 2009. And at the age of 40, 2 years later, he gets on a pro stage, he's 10 pounds heavier. So, of course, everybody's like, two things came to mind. Like, oh, he had a great off season, he put muscle on. How did that happen? Or, hey, this guy's maybe taking something he shouldn't be. But the truth is the fact that in 2009, up to that point, my diets were very assertive. Like I said, no diet breaks. The rate of loss was pretty fast. So I was basically just eating away at muscle during those preps. And then in 2011, it was like aha moment. Like, okay, if I diet a little more slowly, eat a little more food, it just retained a lot more muscle. So I think a combination of maybe a little bit of muscle gain, probably not a lot in between those seasons, but more or less the way the diet, like the approach was, just a more conservative approach. I retained a lot more muscle. So that was a big difference. So I've kind of learned, for me personally, through trial and error, that losing at about a half a pound a week rate is the most ideal for me. But like I said, it wasn't linear through this prep. Like I had moments where I actually had to double that rate. So leading up to my first show, the Muscle Mayhem, it was 3DMJ's 10-year anniversary. That was kind of the show where we kind of met and, kind of formed, what we now know as 3DMJ. So I really wanted to be on stage because Eric Helms was prepping. He was going to be doing that show. So I wanted to make it to that show. And I was a little behind. I was like about 8 weeks, 9 weeks out from that show. And I knew, like, if I didn't start to push a little harder, that I wasn't going to be able to make it to that show in good enough shape. So I brought Eric Helms on. I'm like, hey, Eric, I want you to keep me accountable. So I was checking into him once a week, and we basically doubled the rate of loss. So we were losing at about a pound a week. Sometimes we get a little bit more, but more or less was just a pound a week for about 8 weeks. And it felt like prep at that point. Like prior to that, more of a lifestyle. Like, it was Monday through Friday, I was dieting pretty hard, but then Saturday, Sunday, I'd get a little more relaxed and eat a little more food, have a glass of wine with my wife or whatever. But that 8-week stretch, it was kind of reminiscent of my hardcore days. It was like, okay, we're staying on point and we're grinding through. And yeah, we got to that first show in decent enough shape to be competitive on stage, and I had a great time. But yeah, that was more or less like the rate of loss was like gunning for the half a pound, but there was stints in there where I had to pick the pace up a little bit.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it was one of your Instagram posts or something where you were speculating. You compared your stage look this season compared to one of your prior seasons, and you made visual progress, and you were speculating as to whether you had gained a lot of muscle versus just learned to retain muscle better during prep as well.
Yeah, I mean, because you factor in, like, I think a lot of times when we think off season, we think, okay, we're going to put muscle on, then we're going to increase the stage weight the next
Yeah.
go around. But sometimes it's like it's more visual because you can, let's say, keep the same body weight. Like for me, for my instance, like I've been 170 each of my last three seasons, but each time I look a little bit bigger and a little bit harder. So I think it's just a combination of maybe you're picking up a little bit of muscle in between seasons, you're getting better at retaining muscle,
Mhm.
and I think the longer you train, for whatever reason, um, I don't have any scientific evidence, but as we get older, it seems like our muscles just keep looking denser, like more mature. I don't know if it's like the thinning of the skin or it's just something within the muscle just gets grainier. It's hard. I don't know. Like no one has really been able to tell me, hey, this is what exactly happens with that. But if you take Jeff of 20 years ago and Jeff of now, um, I look far denser, although the body weight, stage weight's really not too much different.
Yeah. The thing of the skin, it's because we all get older and discover tilapia.
Tilapia, yeah, I don't even think I had tilapia once this season. Maybe it was all the canned chicken I ate.
That was a joke for anyone
Yeah.
wondering. Okay, so, and then I also wanted to ask, what were your end macros, and how does that compare to your off-season macros?
So yeah, ending like on the last digging phase where I was kind of like at the very lowest. I think my calories were anywhere between 1,700 to 1,900. Um, and that would kind of like I would flex within that, like based on adherence. So if there was days where I felt pretty good, like I wasn't like over the top hungry, I felt like I could dig a little harder, then I would say, okay, let me take it to 1,700 today. Yeah, but there was days where it's like, man, I'm ready to eat my wife here. So I'm like, I'm gonna keep my calories at 1,900 just to kind of take that edge off. But that's more or less where the lowest calories were at. Um, Protein, like on average, it was anywhere between 160 to 170 grams. And a lot of people freaked out on that because when I started the prep, like I said, I was like over 200 pounds. Like, oh, that's under a gram per pound. But I kind of just look at it like my lean body mass is not 200 pounds, right? So, on stage I'm 170. So lean mass, I'm probably somewhere in the neighborhood of the high 150s. So protein at, 160, 170 is still about a gram per pound.
Mhm.
And then my fats typically are pretty low. And the reason for them being low, like anywhere between 30, 40 grams on most days, sometimes I would go lower for adherence reasons, because when my carbs get a little on the lower side, then yeah, I'm ready to eat my wife, like I said. And it's just it just triggers binges. Like I know myself pretty well now that if I have low carbs for a string of days, adherence isn't the greatest. Where I know if I drop my carbs or fats down rather, and I have a little more carbs, then I can stick to my diet a little bit better. So that's kind of how the macros were, but the calories, like I said, very low at the end, 17, 1900. And then now in my off season, they're probably 3,000, 3,500 on most days. So yeah, it's pretty significant difference, and I'm already feeling way better. Here we are, like 4 weeks post show today, and I'm feeling so much better than I was at the end of that prep.
Yeah. And then I know you do refeeds. How are you setting those up?
So the refeeds, yeah, most of the time they're 2 a week. I autoregulated them a lot. So like in general, it was there were stints where it was twice a week. And fats would be similar to the low days. I keep it on the lower side. They would kind of bump up naturally just because more food's coming in, but they would rarely the fats would get over 60 grams on a refeed days, and carbs were anywhere in the neighborhood of between 4 to 700. And protein would be roughly the same. It might tick up a little bit just naturally because there's more food. But yeah, it's a huge difference, 4 to 700. And I know people are probably like, well, how do you know what to do? So I look at rate of progress, like, okay, what did I get this week as far as like fat loss, weight loss in general, And if it was slow, then I would err on the side of keeping it smaller on the refeeds. But if I felt terrible, like it was just a week where, just energy level wasn't really great. Let's say performance in the gym wasn't really good. And just in general, I was just very, very fatigued. Then I would go higher on the refeeds. I would eat more to kind of, basically recharge the batteries a bit. And even if, let's say, those larger refeeds kind of spike the weight up and you think like, oh, okay, that's going to stall progress a little bit, then I would just basically say, okay, the next week stretch, instead of 5 low days, maybe I need to push it out 6 low days or 7 to get the progress I was looking for. But what's important is that I needed like those moments where you're feeling just like shit. Like you definitely need to recharge your batteries a bit. And with kind of a long prep that I had, it gives you that ability to make that adjustment. Whereas if you have a short timeline and you have to get to a timeline that's really short, like that show date, and you don't have a lot of time, then yeah, it's like no matter if you're feeling good, bad, or average, it's like you have to keep pushing. So sometimes people's end product doesn't look as good on stage because they're just like me back in 2009, just basically being overly assertive. So that's kind of how, more or less, how my approach to refeeds are. A lot of it was auto-regulated. That 8-week stretch that I talked about earlier, where we had to kind of dig a little bit harder. Then yeah, I was sticking more or less to like 400 to 500 grams of carbs, like, and it was like some weeks it was just one refeed a week, to get that rate of progress that Eric and I were looking for. But that 8-week stretch was hard. It wasn't easy, So again, like if I had more time, like if that show was extended out another 4 to 8 weeks, then I could have been a little bit more methodical, with how I auto-regulate those refeeds.
Yeah, no, I really want to delve into this because I find this uh, interesting way of how you set up your macros, and that when you post your Instagram stories and share your macros, you'll have ranges. And I know you just mentioned that you sort of go by how you feel, but how specifically do you navigate these auto-regulated sort of sorry, not but macro ranges throughout just every day? Because I know for myself, at least on my low days, every day like starving, like, and if I had a macro range, I'd probably always be wanting to go to the
To
higher
the
end
higher side.
on low days.
Yeah, so the thing is, it's like there's other things outside of like having calorie range, like food source. Like food source can help with satiety.
Yeah.
Where you kind of eat in your day will help with satiety. So there's other ways to kind of help curb, the hunger levels. Um, when I coach, like let's say athletes that are in there, let's say their first prep, I'm not going to give them ranges because, like I said, even because let's face it, prep, you're going to be hungry, right? It's like what we're doing is we're in a controlled starve. So you have to expect you're going to be hungry throughout it. So mindset's huge. Like you have to embrace the fact that you're going to be hungry. Like I think if you start having that pessimistic mindset around it, where you're getting like, okay, you're trying to find ways to not be hungry, you're just going to end up creating more stress for yourself because you can do all the food manipulation you want, changing food source and changing your times. Like, yeah, we want to try those strategies to help, but in the end, you're still going to be hungry, and you're spending now a lot of energy throughout your day, food focused, and trying to find ways not to be hungry. So sometimes it's better just say, you know what, let's accept it and just move on with the day. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you just kind of have to have that mindset to kind of get through it. What was your original question? Because my mind's
Yeah,
like
so I
right.
guess yeah, so I guess in terms of this auto regulation within your
Oh
macros,
yeah, that's right.
is there a criteria you follow? Like, do you wake up and look at yourself in the mirror and gauge how flat you are, or how you're any sort of
No,
benchmark?
no, it's not that. It's not more like less visual. It's more like, okay, how am I feeling, and where's my adherence at? And the calorie, it's not like I'm having, let's say, having an athlete go, let's say, 1,700 calories as a low, and then it's like 2,200. It's more like for me, like I said, it was 17 and 1,900 calories. So we're talking a 200-calorie variance. And if you think about it over 4 meals, that's, let's say if you were to go from 17 19, that's only 50 calories each meal. Like that's not a lot of calories.
Hmm.
And it also depends on activity levels too,
Yeah.
So, some people are always going to be very static with their activity. It's going to be kind of dynamic. So I also knew too, like if I had to do something, let's say with my son, I had to go to the park and play or whatever, then, if I'm feeling hungry, I'm going to have to do all this extra activity, then I can err on the side of going higher on those calories. But I'm not going to let's say, just because I'm hungry, dictate, oh, I need 1900 calories. Is more or less, okay, where are my energy, where's the energy needs at, and things like that. And if it's like visually like I'm looking terrible, then it wouldn't be like, hey, let's eat at 1900. Like, hey, maybe I need a refeed or
Mm-hmm.
two, to get the glycogen back up and recharge the batteries, have me looking better.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, it's not something that I would recommend to like someone who's prepping for the first time or maybe even the second time. It's more for like people who know their body a little bit better, a little more advanced. Like with some of my athletes that I've prepped 2 or 3 times, I'll roll with these ranges versus like having very hard, rigid macros. Like for you, like if we just started prepping together today, I'd probably give you like more rigid numbers to hit versus like giving you these wide ranges because you'd probably just be a big stress ball trying to figure out, okay, when do I eat low? When do I eat high? But
Yeah.
as you move through time with anything in life, as we get more experience, then we kind of know where our boundaries are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and it's something I definitely want to emphasize with the listeners. It's cool to see as I'm sort of progressing through this journey myself, and this is for this prep. I've been sort of doing the auto-regulated refeeds, similar to you. I refeed on the weekend, and I actually basically go on track and just sort of eat to how I feel, and as long as I'm hitting my protein and then hitting my target weight loss for the week, and I just find this kind of approach is a lot more flexible and sustainable. And I sort of want to alert listeners to the fact that as bodybuilders, we don't need to be weighing every single meal on a scale for the rest of our careers, and or at least tracking things so rigidly. And that at some point you want to be looking for that level of experience where you can move away from really strict numbers.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think too, it's like it's kind of like where you what the goals are, where you're at in within that timeline and context. Like sometimes you do need to be a little more rigid, but other times not so much. Like for me right now, this week I say, okay, I'm done tracking. I've been tracking for 14 months. I'm done with it. But with 30 years of experience, more than 30, I kind of know more or less what a chicken breast looks like. So
Yeah.
it's just kind of depends on the situations. um but yeah, I agree with kind of what you said there. Yeah.
hmm Now, going on to the activity, what you were mentioning, what was cardio like for you?
So cardio, what's interesting is cardio in the past has always been kind of like, hey Jeff, let's jump on this recumbent bike and pedal and keep track of time. Like the intensity level is always kind of the same.
Mhm.
Typically it's like lists. So instead of tracking it through, let's say, calories, I just track the time because the intensity was always the same. So if I need to adjust cardio up or down, I just adjust the time or the number of days I do it. Whereas this prep, I decided to track steps instead because it's an easier and more, I guess you could say that as far as quantifying activity level, it's a little more accurate than not tracking steps because you some days like deep in a prep too when like energy levels get low, food levels get low, most people tend to get a little more lethargic, so overall activity kind of goes down. Like just sitting in your chair, like if you have good energy you got good posture, but yeah, when you're deep in a prep, your food levels low, like your posture maybe not as good, so you're not fighting gravity as much, so you're burning less calories.
Yeah.
So keeping track of steps was a good way to keep me accountable as far as staying active, especially when I needed, let's say, dig a little harder and get those calories lower. So it was more or less it was a step count through the prep. I did get an injury, a walking injury. I got tibialis tendonitis like really severely,
Wow.
and I had to stop walking. So I had to go back to my recumbent bike. And the way I kind of equated that was like 30 minutes on a recumbent at the pace I was doing was like equivalent to about 4 or 5 thousand steps. So I would just equate it that way. So whatever I lost through walking, I just picked up with the bike. But that was kind of like more or less what I did for cardio. So it wasn't like I need to burn 400 calories on a treadmill or something like that. It was more or less let's keep track of steps. So on average, when I first started the prep, it was like my average step count's like 3 to 5, like in the off season. So I had at one point in my prep that 8-week stretch leading up to the first show got as high as 18,000, like 6 days a week.
Okay.
And that's what basically killed my shin. And then after that, you had to go back to the bike. So on the bike, it would be anywhere between 5, 6 days a week, 45 minutes to an hour each session. That was more or less my cardio, but like no hit cardio or anything like that. Like I'm not a fan of hit just because it's very demanding. Not that it's not productive, like it can be productive, but I think we both know it's like very intense.
Hmm.
And for me, it's like it just takes too much energy. So it wipes out my weight training performance. Like I just can't recover from hit and all the weight training and all that. So that's not a really big fan of hit just for that reason.
Hmm. Yeah. And then coming back to the non-linearity of your prep, sort of when did your macro drops happen, and how did you gauge those drops?
Yeah, what's interesting is that I didn't change my calories through the entire prep for the most
Wow.
part. Like they were anywhere like I auto regulated those low days, like I mentioned. So they would be anywhere between 1,700 to 2,000
Hmm.
the entire prep. So, there was stints where there was like maybe some days at 2,000, some days at 1,700. And really the biggest change, like the biggest thing I was adjusting outside of those lower calories was the refeed days. So I would progress well between 1,700 to 2,000. It was just more or less when do I refeed? How much do I refeed? So that was like the biggest thing I was adjusting outside of like, okay, when I adjust my overall macros.
Hmm.
So that was kind of like interesting was that, it stayed fairly linear as far as those lower day macros through the entire prep. Towards the end, I did the last 10, like probably 2 weeks, I should say 2 weeks there. I had the lower calorie days. I kept them more or less, at 2,000. Actually started to increase food a little bit heading into Worlds, just
Hmm.
so I didn't look as flat and depleted. Because towards the end of my prep, what I learned looking in hindsight now, this what's beautiful about hindsight is you can see really clear, right? It's 2020 vision. So now looking in hindsight, like that prep was probably about 2 months too long. The last 2 months, there was some issues like I had 2 Mexico trips, got sick on both of those trips. So it made it hard to train. My body was already in a depleted state. So getting sick really didn't help my cause. So I did notice like I looked a little on the flatter side, depleted side, the last couple of shows I did. Um, so that was, yeah. So that was like one thing I did learn and take from this prep was like, okay, next time around, one, let's not have these Mexico trips. Like, let's not book 2 long-distance trips back to back about 3 or 4 weeks before Worlds, and let's not diet as long. Because what I learned, I think, is that when you're in a very lean state like that, like the longer you stay in it, like you look good to a point, but then the longer you're there, it's just really hard to maintain a healthy look because your body is like it's like in survival mode at that point.
Hmm.
And I even had an athlete that was prepping. We had similar paths. We kind of started our preps in a similar way, and we both did Worlds. And the same thing with him. Like his earlier shows, he looked a little bit better than he did at the end. So that's something that I think Eric and I talked about. Yeah, we need to probably make sure that our athletes aren't prepping for extensive periods of time.
Hmm. Yeah. Did you take diet breaks, and when were those?
It's more auto-regulated. Like I
Yeah.
didn't like in general, I didn't say, okay, every 8 to 10 weeks, let's take a diet break. It was more or
Yeah.
less more auto-regulated.
Mhm.
Um, so it was more mainly around like I said at the end of 2018, it was a
Yeah.
diet break of like I think it was like a week and a half, 2 weeks around the holidays. And then it would be like, other holidays might be a day, 2 days, 3 days. I took a diet break after the first show I did in July. That was like a 4-day diet break. I'm trying to think of when I did another substantive one. Let's say it might have been after like two shows, like a couple of shows down the road. I think I took another. Yeah, it was after the NGA Pro show that I won in September. I took a little bit of a diet break there, like a 2 or 3 day diet break, and that's like those diet breaks weren't like, hey, let's keep the fats low. It was more or less, hey, let's have some pizza and chocolate cake because I just
Yeah.
won this pro show.
Yeah.
So some celebrating, some a decent amount of calories coming in there, and then I would just kind of get back on things like a couple days later. enroll on. So it was more auto-regulated. It wasn't like, kind of like what you hear out there with the science, hey, every 8 to 10 weeks. Like with my athletes, it's a little more rigid at times. Like, okay, we're going to take these diet breaks every 8 to 10 weeks. But even with my athletes, sometimes it's auto-regulated. Like we'll get, in a week 8, 9, or 10 of prep. But if things are going really well, like they feel okay, we're progressing really well, they're looking great, then hey, let's keep pushing out. We don't need to take the diet break yet. We'll push it out. But yeah, taking them every so often is a good idea, just to recharge your batteries. Physically it's a good idea, but also mentally, emotionally, it's nice to kind of take a break away from it.
Hmm. Yeah, the mental aspect really helps a lot.
Yeah.
Mm.
The mental part of prep is huge. Like in my opinion, it's like that's where a lot of people have a harder time versus, let's say, the physicality. I mean, yeah, we're gonna be hungry, tired at times, but it's like the mental drain it takes on you.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Shifting gears a little bit, what did your training look like in terms of your split and volume?
Sure. So it kind of changed throughout the prep, very dynamic, just based on kind of where I was with energy and recovery, aches and pains. But the like the structure of my training, like the foundation, it's upper lower split. So upper lower off, upper lower 2 days off. That was kind of the basis of it, and that's still the basis of it. Like I've been training that way for like 10 years now, just because it's so flexible with life. When you have an upper lower split, you can easily flex it around life. So that was kind of the basis, the foundation. But what changed a lot with my training, not so much volume. Volume, I mean, yeah, volume would change. Like if I was feeling really run down and drained, then I would say, okay, I'm going to go on the low side of volume. If I felt really good, good energy, I can do an extra set or two. Hey, let's do it. But the most change that I saw with training was exercise selection, just because of aches and pains. And I did pick up a couple of injuries through that prep. I tore my upper pec doing heavy RDLs.
Mm.
So I had to switch out RDLs to like hyperextensions, Smith machine hip thrust. I had to find other ways to hip hinge outside of RDL and deadlifting, just because I had that injury. And of course, having a torn upper pec, then I had to figure out how to train chest without tearing my chest more. So I was
Mhm.
like, okay, I can do a decline Smith bench, like a pen press, to shorten the range of motion. So I was doing that for a while. So the big thing was just like, changing exercises to kind of benefit the stage of prep I was in. So obviously, when you have more body fat on you, you're a little more pliable. So early on in the prep, I can get away with the heavy RDLs.
Mhm.
But I didn't listen to my body well enough and signal and those warning signs ahead of time, because I was feeling a little bit of strain, like in my upper traps and things like that. Like I should have like known at that point, hey, okay, this is getting to be a little crazy. Either one, I need to maybe lower the weight down, go on a higher rep range on this RDL, so it's a little safer, because my body fat levels are getting lower, leverages were getting not as advantageous. So the risk for injury was kind of going up, but I was ignoring some of those signs
Mhm.
and I got injured. So, it's trying to stay on top of like modifying training in a way to stay safe, because we become, most people, not everybody, but we become less pliable, the leaner we get. And I think that's, like those heavy deadlifts, squats, those types of things. Yeah, that's basically what I kind of threw out there. Probably like halfway through the prep and beyond, like was just none of those heavy compounds.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is something I think a lot of lifters struggle with, is that when we're dieting, we have trouble with our big heavy lifts, and
Hmm.
our egos are so married to those numbers. Like you really want to squat and deadlift, and you want to
Yeah.
keep up your numbers, and when things start eroding, it's hard to let go.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but man, when I get pretty lean, it's like I don't want to get under a squat bar. It's like I
Yeah,
just like, oh, this feels terrible. But yeah, our egos is like, well, we have to squat because the squat is like the king of lower body exercises.
exactly.
Like, no, you can do a leg press to hit your quads. You can do leg extensions to hit your quads. You can do leg curls. You can do hip thrusts, RDL or whatever, pull throughs for glutes. Like, there's other movements that you could do that are safer. You could still get effective volume in there. And then that way you're not injured, because the last thing you want to do is like get injured or have aches and pains, because that's basically going to erode your physique even more. And then when you get on stage, it's, yeah, you're just not going to look the part. And that's what derailed my prep in 2017-18 was injuries. It was just like, okay, I never made it to the stage. And that was, man, that was eye opening. I felt like I was a failure, but the failure actually helped me get on stage this year. That was the reason why I made it in 2019, was because of those failed preps.
Hmm. Now, something I wanted to ask was when you make those substitutions, like switching RDLs for, you do like glute ham raise type um, exercise, did you change the volume? Like, did you have to increase the number of sets to get the same amount of stimulus, or was your volume changing throughout prep?
So before I even answer that, like methodically, like think about what it takes to actually see atrophy.
Hmm.
Like atrophy would probably happen in what, 3 or 4 weeks, maybe, if you stop training altogether. So that gives me peace of mind knowing, okay, if I go from an RDL and now I go to a hyperextension, I'm still training the musculature. So the only way I'm going to see muscle loss is if I don't train that musculature at all.
Hmm.
So basically, it was like, okay, 3 sets of RDLs. I want to say, let me do 3 sets of hyperextensions, and just make sure that the intensity is where it needs to be.
Hmm.
Um, so that way you're creating stimulus on the muscle. So that's how my mentality was working. And of course, it's nice when Eric Helms says, hey, hey, you can't do RDL, let's go to hyperextension. You get reassurance from somebody. But I already know from past experience that, the only way I see atrophy is when I stop training. And that's most people. I mean, we're not going to all of a sudden wither away because we're going from a squat to a leg press, a hip thrust, and a leg curl. Like, it's
Hmm.
just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing for people to keep in mind, is that it's harder to lose muscle than you think.
Yeah, it takes a lot, actually. Yeah. So that just gives me peace of mind. I think a lot, even in the off season, I'm like, okay, just because it's off season and now my food supply is higher doesn't mean I have to go back to RDL. I enjoy doing RDLs, but if I stick to, let's say, the same movements from prep, and I just all of a sudden your food level goes up, like if you held on to all your muscle during prep, like a good chunk of it, even with, let's say, the exercises that you might have thought might have been suboptimal, but they're really not. But let's just say that was kind of the mentality.
Hmm.
Like think of now, okay, you're in a depleted state in prep. You have lower calories. Your body's in a less pliable state, and you're just kind of hanging on by a thread in general. Come out of prep, now all of a sudden food is way up. You're gaining, more body fat now. You're becoming more pliable. Even if you stick to the same movements, like they're going to be that much more productive, just because you're now in more of a surplus versus like obviously a deficit. So again, it's like I think people, like, they just get like very insecure if they're not doing the quote unquote what the general recommendation is, as far as, hey, the squats, the deadlifts, these big lifts are like the king of exercises. For me, what I'm learning is like, no, you need to do what feels comfortable, what feels safe, what obviously is effective, but and what you enjoy. Because if you're doing those 3 things over time, you're going to be able to sustain.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So now I also want to talk a little bit about peaking. So I know you talked about this with Steve, and that you actually had different approaches for different shows. And I wanted to ask it now, in hindsight, do you have any insights into your how your body works for that?
Man, I tried a couple different things like we talked about on Steve's podcast. And I think, well, it's kind of interesting because you might think something works well for a show. Like you do a show, you're like, okay, that worked great. I peaked well. And then you go into the next show and you try to duplicate it, which I tried to do, and it didn't work the same. It was almost like, why didn't that work like it did a week ago? Which is interesting. I think a lot of it too is like the lead up to your shows, like depending on, like, sometimes you might be doing some hard digging, maybe you're not, maybe you're eating up into shows. So really, like, the lead up, I think, can impact as far as how we peak. But it's, to me, it's more art than it is, let's say, science. I think a lot of us want to think like, oh, it's science, like there's this special magic formula to it,
No.
and not really. So I've had preps in the past where, like, I'm gonna have, like, okay, I'm gonna load up heavy on carbs and do yada yada yada, and I'm like, yeah, that worked great. And then I've had other peaks where I'm like, you know what, I'm not even gonna change anything. I look great a week out. I'm just gonna do the same, like keep my macros the same the entire time, water the same, and just go into a show and just put some tanner on and pose, and I've looked great that way. So it's just, in general, it's hard to kind of say what is like the quote unquote best peaking method.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I've done close to 40 shows now, I think, somewhere in there, and I still haven't found like the perfect peak yet. But I will say what's really important, I do think has a huge impact on how we look is like stress levels. What I've noticed with myself and my athletes is when I'm a little more high strung, then yeah, my body just doesn't look as well. It looks a little blurred, and I think just like cortisol levels get jacked up when you hold some water up. So I think trying to stay very like poised through that last week heading into a show. Like for me, when I travel to shows, I like try to make sure I get there in like 2 days in advance, so I can get like everything situated, the hotel, the food, like get everything just lined up. So that way on Friday, the day before a show, I'm just really chilled. I'm going about the day really relaxed. I
Mm-hmm.
think it does have a pretty big, impact on how we look. But yeah, I tried different things this prep. Like I went in with like, okay, let me jack my water up real high. I said, hey, let me cut some water down. And, as that's interesting is I get deeper into my off season. I keep looking back on the photos and trying to assess these, like still trying to figure out where I peaked well, the things
Yeah.
I did. And I keep changing my mind. Like on Steve's show, I said, hey, I didn't look as good at Worlds. But now that I got the professional pictures back and study, I'm like, I actually look pretty darn good at Worlds. And
Mm-hmm.
for Worlds, it was the day before the show. I had about 800 grams of carbs. Like I really went heavy on the
Wow.
load. Yeah, my water
Fun.
intake was about 2 gallons that day. Went a little heavier on the water. Sodium level, I jacked way up purposely to try to, make sure I was nice and full. And I peaked pretty well. And I actually was like, I actually look better than I thought. Because I thought Worlds I looked my worst when I was talking with Steve. And like I said, like when you try to assess these peaks too, like if you think about it, you're gauging it off the pictures that you get back or the video you get back.
Mm-hmm.
Stage lighting plays a huge role in how we look on stage. And then as far as like camera quality too, who's taking the photos, what
Yeah.
kind of cameras do they have? Like all that plays a huge role. So when I look at like some of the earlier shows, like I peaked really well for guest posing in Washington. Well, the photos I got back there were taken from smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gauging the smartphone versus the World's. I don't know what kind of cameras they use at Worlds, but they have really high quality cameras, and the lighting was different between those two stages. So it's like, did I really peak better at the guest posing than I did at Worlds, or did it? So it's really hard to say exactly, what method might have been better or not, because again, it's like you're using, all these different aspects. It's trying to assess it. But I think in general, like every show, I think I peaked pretty well, and the methodology was very similar. The NPC show, I did play around with water manipulation a little bit. I cut water down. Like my usual intake's about 1.5 gallons, 2 gallons a day. So I went the day before the NPC show, I went about 3/4 of a gallon, somewhere in there. So I cut my water way down, and I thought I peaked well. Like, I look harder, and again, it's like, but I look at Worlds, I'm like, well, I look better there. And is it the pictures? I don't know. So it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to say, exactly. I wish I
Mm-hmm.
had a finite answer for everybody on that. I just don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting sort of little phenomena in bodybuilding because everyone has such strong opinions, and a lot of people think there's a real science and they figured it out. And comes to where you talk about the art of bodybuilding, and from what I've seen or my thoughts on the literature, like I don't think we'll ever really understand this physiology to that granularity, like because peaking is such a short period of time, and it's going to be virtually impossible to design some sort of study where we actually get that kind of data. And it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast recently with Chris Aceto on it, who,
Mhm.
for the listeners, is a pretty famous bodybuilding coach. He coached Jay Cutler and a bunch of other of the famous guys. But he was talking about how he peaks people totally different for every show, just depending on how they've been looking leading up into it,
Yeah.
and which ties into sort of your thought on sort of your state before the show, depending on how you should approach it. And he shares a story of one of the podcast bodybuilders who it was like the day before the show, and they were traveling, and they show up to some grocery store looking for their usual foods, and they couldn't find the usual carb up, whatever, oatmeal probably. And so Chris Aceto just walks over to this bakery and comes out with this massive cinnamon bun and says, "Eat this."
Yeah.
And then they like peaked great and like won the overall or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, like for one of my show, like in general, that's kind of my thought process with a lot of my athletes is like leading up. Okay, how are we looking leading up? How do you look around these refeeds? Because that's pretty important to see. Okay, if we're having refeeds, are you looking better the day after, 2 days after? Do you look better before the refeeds? So getting this data collected ahead of time kind of gives me clues as to how to set that peak week up. So in general, I try to keep things very stable and consistent with what an athlete is doing, with that lead up. Like I try to just maintain that through peak week. So there's no like, oh crap, we did something totally different and all of a sudden you look terrible. So it's more or less, I try to keep things very stable. But what's interesting about the peaks that I had personally, like I remember after the what show was it? It was after one. I can't remember what show it was, but my wife and I we went out and I had pizza, and of course pizza's super salty and all that. And the next morning I was like, well shit, why couldn't I look like that last night? So it's like, okay, in my mind I'm like, okay, was it more carbs from the pizza? Was it the fat? Was it the sodium? Like all these things you're like kind of figuring out. And then I think, okay, what was the lead up into the show? And I'm like, okay, how can I maybe duplicate this? So my wife is always saying, hey, you look better the night before or the next morning. It's happened twice now. Why don't you just eat at what you eat post show, the celebratory meal, and have it before the. So that's basically what I did for Worlds. I'm like, okay, of course I made the pizza, so it was lower fat, but I made basically pizza Friday night before Worlds.
Nice.
And so in my mind, I was like, okay, I had this pizza the next day, and looking at some of the pictures from people's smartphones, like, okay, that didn't work out too well. I don't look that great. But then after seeing the professional shots, I'm like, yeah, I peaked actually pretty damn well. So is it the pizza or was it the lead up? Yeah, again, it's just like we really don't know. Yeah, but I'm very open to experimenting because in my mind, I'm like, that's the only way I'm going to learn more about myself is if I go through some trial and error. And that's how I've learned for over 30 years. Like we can read all the science ahead of time. And in theory, yeah, it makes sense, right? Okay, yeah, science says to do this. Then I always look at, okay, how can I apply that to my situation? Sometimes it's not practical. Like you take something that science says and try to apply it. You're like, that's not practical. That makes me more of a stress ball. I'd rather do something a little less suboptimal, but if it makes me happier, my stress levels are lower, then I'm gonna enjoy my journey. I'm gonna sustain it more. So that's kind of for me personally. Like I'm never fearful anymore. There was a time back in the day where I'd be scared to try things. You're like, oh shit, this might not work. What's the worst that can happen? You figure out that it doesn't work, so you now know not to do that again.
Yeah.
And you move on. It's kind of like your kid, right? Like I tell my son, hey, don't touch the stove. Of course, hopefully he doesn't touch the stove. I'm gonna tell him not to. But sometimes like, well, here's a better story. So my ex-wife, right?
Yeah.
When she was a little girl, I remember her dad telling me this story that, he told her, don't touch the candle. She was like intrigued by the candle. She was like trying to reach and grab it. He's like, don't touch that. And of course she wasn't going to listen. So she touched it and she burned her fingers. So even though he was trying to reinforce to her, hey, it's not smart to touch that candle, she still touched it anyway. But she definitely learned after touching it not to touch it again. So to me, it's like kind of the same concept, with bodybuilding or in life. Like sometimes you just have to go through shit in order to find your own answers. And I think a lot of people are just like, that's a lot of questions I get on Instagram constantly is, where should my volume be? Am I doing too much volume? Am I doing enough? How do I peak? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, how do I know what someone's volume should be ahead of time? So that's kind of what I do as a coach. Like, okay, in theory, let me put your volume you know, in this realm, but it doesn't mean it's going to work out. It might not, but that's basically you have to go through the process, collect your own data, and eventually you find your own answers.
Hmm.
I'm on a long rant right now, aren't I? Are we still talking about prep? I don't know.
Just we're just trying to get your homemade pizza recipe now.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, what was frustrating is because they didn't have a Trader Joe's where my Airbnb was, so I had to resort to Boboli. And Boboli, let's say their crust, yeah, it's not as good as Trader Joe's. Maybe that's why I didn't place top five at Worlds. I didn't have the Trader Joe dough. I had to
Definitely.
stick with Boboli. It's Boboli's fault why I didn't place top five.
Now, just talking about the experimentation thing and learning from your experiences, is there something? What would you do differently in your next season? Do you think I know you mentioned about the length of the prep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's man, it's hard to say because I kind of think like shit, I'm gonna be 49 in June. So by the time I get on stage, I'll be 50. So it's hard to say exactly what I would have to do different. I can look at this past prep and learn from some of the mistakes I made. And the major one was, like I said earlier, not paying attention to those warning signs my body was giving me about those RDLs. Like I knew in advance, like, okay, this shit's getting hard, but I was a little stubborn. Like it was kind of cool. Like every week I'm going in there doing RDLs, right? You're like, I'm setting these PRs in my prep on RDL. And of course, when you're sharing things like that online, then you get positive reinforcement from people. Oh, that's cool. Hey, keep going. So I need to do a better job of like paying less attention to like the people giving you kudos and more like, hey, just stay in your lane. And if your body's telling you to back off, especially at my age, as I head into the half century mark, I'll be 50 pretty
Mm.
soon. So yeah, that's one thing that I need to do a better job moving forward. But yeah, I think the big takeaway though is like I mentioned earlier, like that prep was just a little too long. So I think the next time I compete in 2021, I have to kind of make a decision on whether I'm going to make worlds more of the focus, or just, hey, let's just do some shows for fun because that will change trajectory. Because the way the season's set up for WNBF, the Worlds is always in November. The
Mhm.
Muscle Mayhem here in Sacramento, California, it's in July, and that's a big like. I love that show. That's kind of like my home show.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's like from July to November is such a long, long stretch. So I need to make a decision on whether, my focus is world. If it's worlds and it's, of course, we don't need to prep for 14 months. Hey, let's start to prep later on and let's keep my body weight a little bit leaner in the off season because that's one of the reasons why I have such a long timeline for prep is because I have to shed those 33 pounds. So if I can keep myself a little tighter in the off season and not venture, let's say over 195, and maybe take a diet before the diet, like we like to say, which just means, hey, let's do a mini cut before the actual prep starts, and take some of that weight off ahead of time. Then it'll make the timeline a lot shorter. So that's basically the big takeaways from a prep. I think from a big picture standpoint.
Hmm. Yeah, I know how you were talking about how your body started feeling tired and sort of looking that, reflecting
Hmm.
how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And prep is definitely really tough on the body. So,
Not just the body, but it's also tough on the family, putting through those people that, your loved ones, they're supporting you. But I mean, when you're doing it for 12, 14 month stretch of time, because there's a lot of hyper focus there, on my end. So that energy you're putting into that endeavor, it's some of that energy gets taken away from other things in life. So to have 14-month stretch for that, that's, not really too reasonable, I think. So that's, one of the amazing reasons why I'm taking 2020 off. It's like one, I need a break. Like my body definitely needs a break.
mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I need to spend more energy, elsewhere outside of bodybuilding, just to be fair, to those I love, people I love. Because at my age, it's like I've put the work in, like I have a good enough physique where I can probably compete every year, but it's just too hard, like physically. And then, like I said, and those around us, I think we have to think about that too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a very central part of what I try and educate people on is that once you figure out something that's optimal, you then want to make it as sustainable as possible, because life isn't just about bodybuilding. And as much as we'd like to be robots and just living our robotic life, it's not really like that.
Yeah, I mean, if we really want to get deep with the conversation, because like when we listen to podcasts or we look at the science, everything's about being optimal. But I think when we look at like life, like, is it really optimal if you're like some people, they get very obsessive when they're prepping and they get very selfish. I mean, is it really optimal that we're being an asshole, to everybody around us for 6 months, a year? So there's a lot of things I think that a lot of us don't see online. Like all we see is like we see a shredded physique. We see this person saying, "Oh, I'm optimal. I'm losing X amount of weight per week. I'm hitting X amount of protein. I'm being very optimal to science. Look at me. I look awesome." But we don't always see the full truths or maybe the story behind all that. Is the day to day. Not everybody's going to share like the darker side. Like I try to do that to a certain degree. Like I try to share like, hey, this shit sucks. This is how it's impacting this or that, like real life stuff. So like in my darker days of bodybuilding, I talk about that online quite a bit, from the time I was in my early 20s when I first started competing until I was probably in my mid 30s. It was all about trying to be optimal, trying to be perfect. And because of that, a lot of my relationships sacrificed, whether it was my ex-wife, job, other relationships. It was just like looking in hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, it's like I put bodybuilding on the front burner and everything else got put on the back burner. So that's why I stress now, like it's important to try to balance things out. And it's never perfect. Like you're never going to be able to say, yeah, my relationships were perfect, through a prep or and all that. Like it's never going to be perfect, but it can be better.
Yeah.
And I always say, like, yeah, I mean, if anything, if it's always a good idea to maybe buy a rose or a dozen roses, or hey, like get your significant other a cup of coffee in the morning just to show that hey, you still care. Because sometimes, like, without even realizing it, we're just always on ourselves. So I think that to me, it's like I just want to put myself out there and show that hey, we're human, we're not robots. And you have to kind of ask yourself, if I'm trying to be this perfect bodybuilder on paper according to X, Y, and Z science, what's this other part of your life? Is it suffering because of it? And then gets the question is this optimal, or is it maybe optimal here, so in the middle? So that's kind of like, and I think over time, if you ask more experienced bodybuilders, you're probably going to get similar responses to maybe what the answer. Like you're going to get more gray responses than black or white responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is something I think I learned from you must have been from a podcast a while ago. But you were saying that you have this prep mantra, and the first part is don't be a dick.
Yeah, don't be a dick.
People you love, right?
Yeah. And that's based off experience, right? That wasn't. Yeah, it's not something. The science didn't tell me don't be a dick. I was like, oh shit. Yeah, okay. I was an actual dick for my first decade of my bodybuilding career. And some of those like I did win decent amount of, division titles and all this, during that era. I don't look back on that and go, oh man, I'm so proud of these wins. It's like, man, I was not so proud. Like now it's like this past contest season, like I won a pro show. I took second in two other pro shows, took sixth at Worlds. Like I'm far more proud of that now because of the approach that I've taken. And again, not a perfect one, but a far superior approach than it was, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago. Because it's like I'm not that selfish, egotistical, hardcore bodybuilder that I once was. So that, like, when I look back at the accomplishment of this season, it's not the placings, it's more about the journey, the approach, the enjoyment that I had, like making sure that I was including my family in on the prep. So it's those things that I take away as being the most proud. Mm-hmm. Because let's face it, 5 years from now, no one's going to go, oh, Jeff, hey, in 2019, he got six at Worlds at 48. Like, no one's going to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows when I won pro cards or pro titles. Like no one's gonna remember all that stuff. But trust me, your family or whatever, if you're an asshole through that, they're gonna go, oh yeah, that was the time you won that show. You're a dick. They're gonna remember that. So
Yeah.
that's what I try to teach others through my platform and as well as being a coach with my athletes.
Mm-hmm. Going along the sustainability slant, has there been any changes to your training philosophy throughout the years? In terms
Yeah,
of, just in terms of your splits, volume, anything.
I'll share a story that changed my approach. So up until 2013, I've always been pretty intense, pretty like, hey, let's get after it. I've always been like someone who puts out a lot of effort in the weight room. I still do, but there's a lot more control now than there was, let's say, prior to 2013. So 2013, I tore my calf, and I didn't listen to my body. It was telling me through the training session that, hey, it just doesn't feel right. So when I got to my calf training, I tore my calf. I felt like, man, it felt like someone took a pair of scissors and started cutting through my calf. That's what it felt like.
Mm.
But I basically let ego dictate that training session. It was like, okay, I feel a little off. Don't be a sissy. Keep pushing hard. Body was giving me warning signs, and I just ignored it because I knew I was like in the middle of the training session. I'm like, I probably should stop and just come back tomorrow and train. But I'm like, nah, just keep pushing. Well, learn the hard way. So going through that calf tear, it took like 11 weeks to heal. It took me about 4 or 5 months, somewhere in there, to get back to normal again, like to get my training back up to speed. So I lost a lot of time, with training and progress and things like that. So it just really opened my eye that from an ego standpoint, we can't always like push ourselves no matter what. Like you have to, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? On one side of the sword, we have to be go-getters and push, but on the other side, it can bite you in the ass, like I learned. So it just changed my approach to training. Like it just kind of held me back off a little bit and think a little more methodical about it. And I'm still not perfect because obviously, like I said, I got injured this last prep, but I've been doing a lot better job at it. I think too, when you're younger, you're more pliable, so you can get away with, let's say, overreaching at times. It's like,
Yeah.
or you're just pushing a little too hard because your body's more pliable. But as you get older, that shit starts to catch up to you, and you start to get injured. Like now that I'm in my 40s, it's like like every set I do, and this is something I talked about. We had just did a podcast with Eric and Brad on my prep,
Yeah.
and we were talking about this. Like I just like every set I do now, there's like a little bit of fear in me, like don't get hurt, don't get hurt. So I'm like very mindful of my form, my control. So I might slow rep speed down purposely, not because, hey, I think it's going to make me grow more, like, hey, more time under tension. It's like, no, so I don't snap and break. So I'm thinking longevity and sustainability. So sometimes, we can read into the science again, like, okay, science says to train this way, but I look at it more from a practical standpoint. Like, okay, how can I train to keep me safe and so I can progress over time? So that's kind of like, my philosophy now with training. It's more like, okay, what's going to be the most practical, not the most optimal. And sometimes when you're doing things more practical, it ends up being more optimal over the long haul.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's definitely something I noticed from your social media is that you train with very measured and controlled technique, and it was too. I think I was watching that story when you strained your back doing
The leg press.
leg presses, and I was choked, man. Like I was watching or following your prep, and I thought your form was perfect. I didn't see any
Yeah.
for it,
Yeah, I mean, it looks like, if you look at it quick, it looks like, oh, there was wrong with that. But what ended up happening was like the leg press that we're talking about. It's like a hybrid hack leg press. And the way that thing is designed, like for me personally, like the way my body fits into it, if I put any pressure on my heel, like I try to drive through my heels on that machine, it'll basically take my butt away from the backing. Like my lower back and butt will come off the pad ever so slightly. And so I know in my mind, like, okay, I need to make sure that the pressure, I keep it on my midfoot or my toes or both to keep my back firmly in place on the padding. So that way I don't get strained. Well, that session, that rep, that's what happened. I drove through my heels too much. And it just like my butt came off. Maybe I slowed it down in slow speed to kind of see what happened. My butt came off maybe a half inch to an inch, but that's all it takes sometimes. And my
Mm-hmm.
lower back said, "No, you're not having it today," and I got injured. And there's also too, if I think about prior to that, like I slept on the floor at the airport the night before
Oh, wow.
because I was
Yeah.
coming back from the show and the flight got delayed, so I had to sleep on the floor at the airport. And then it was a 6-hour flight, so I was already stiff. So two things I learned from that was like, okay, make sure I drive through my toes on that exercise. And two, when you're traveling, don't do legs the next day. Maybe take a day off or do upper body. Yeah. So again, it's like we go through these experiences and we learn. Like you want to, think about, the experience that you're in, assess it and learn from it. Don't just say, "Oh, that was just a fluke that I hurt my lower back. Let's continue to, train lower days after a long airport delay. And hey, let's drive through my heels on this exercise because Joey on the internet said, hey, it's when you're doing leg press, you should be driving through your heels, or squatting, you should be driving through yours." Like, no, do what is going to make you in particular the safest.
Mm-hmm. In terms of your injuries over the years, is there any major modifications you've made to accommodate chronic injuries, like sort of changes in frequency or anything for certain muscle groups?
Good question. So for me personally, yeah,
Yeah.
I think for me, I kind of know my thresholds. Again, experience over time. Like for me in general, like anything more than 3 or 4 sets ends up being like too much. One, quality just goes down in my training, stamina goes down, form breaks down, that type of thing. If I train more than 4 days a week, I might be able to get away with it for a week or two, but then the accumulation of fatigue over successive weeks training more than 4 days per week. So I just don't recover as well. I get more aches and pains, a little more grumpy, crabby. Motivation to train goes down. So I know kind of like a 4 days per week is kind of my threshold. So those are kind of some of the things that I've picked up over the years with myself. Sure, I can probably train more days per week if I bring the intensity way down, like make your training sessions easier. But then the question is, how productive is that going to be? Then it ends
Mm-hmm.
up turning into fluffy workouts. So to basically kind of like still work with intent to try to be productive in building more muscle, then yeah, my threshold is like 4 days per week with that type of intensity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really valuable. And just a note, but I think it's interesting how you said that you found upper lower splits to be the most sustainable for you. And
Mhm.
because like I've sort of settled on the same conclusion for myself, I train like upper lower. It's just really flexible in terms of stacking the days next to each other and like shuffling them around.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think we're coming to a close here. I'm just gonna wrap this up by saying, yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Jeff. I think there have been a lot of pearls from this talk that I think people will benefit from. Where can people find you?
You can find me mainly on Instagram, so 3DMJ Godfather on Instagram. You can find me on 3dmusclejourney.com website, and on YouTube, we're YouTube/Team 3DMJ.
Mhm. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll link Jeff's information in the show notes below. Make sure you check him out. He's a fantastic resource and coach.